very frustrated. Like, we have people in the community who want to make a difference, and we're not able to do that.
I should at some point be able to speak up and have a controlling decision in what's done with my investment.
Austin is growing fast, and new housing developments almost always have a homeowners association that's supposed to work for you. Good morning, and thank you for joining us for State of Texas. I'm Josh Hinkle. We've discovered a loophole in state law that leaves many of you without a say in what your HOA does and how it spends your money. KXAN lead investigator Brian Collister found many homeowners say their voice is not heard in meetings because they don't control their own board. The developer does.
We found glass in the playscape, and we're out there cleaning it up. And if we didn't do that, there could be a kid that could slip, fall, cut themselves.
Reina Ortega worries her sons Jonas and Jason will get hurt when playing in her South Austin neighborhood park.
Are you okay? You're okay. You want to try again? Sometimes we come to the park and there'll be broken bottles or beer tops, condoms.
Left over from people hanging out in the park at night when the park is supposed to be closed. Ortega says her husband was even attacked earlier this year by a group of teenagers when he told them they couldn't be there after dark.
As he turns to leave, he gets hit in the side of the head with a branch, and he goes down.
Ortega and neighbors turned to their homeowners association here in Bradshaw Crossing, complaining for months about a lack of lights for safety in the park. This is what the park looks like during the day, and this is after sundown. But the HOA did nothing, and the park still sits cloaked in darkness as homeowners continue to pay their HOA dues.
That's pretty much my opinion, is they just don't want to do it.
It does make me mad. It's just, it makes everyone mad.
Robin Callan has lived in another South Austin neighborhood, Colorado Crossing, for 9 years. Since January of 2016, her HOA increased residents' dues by 33% to pay for this still unfinished pool and amenity center.
We don't have ownership of or control of the HOA as homeowners in the community. So in a sense, it's taxation without representation.
The builder of both neighborhoods, Lennar, controls the homeowners associations. That's because the way state law is currently written, there is no limit to what's called the development period. Essentially, how long a developer or builder can control an HOA.
Is there any way we can look at the plans of the park to see if maybe back then the lights were supposed to be put in and they never got put in?
I can certainly take a look at that.
At HOA meetings like these, homeowners tell us they raise concerns but don't get results from the developer. So we caught up with a Lennar representative outside to ask why not give these homeowners control.
Well, because we're still the declarant of the HOA, and that's how they're designed.
Calling it a homeowners association is kind of misleading.
Real estate attorney Bill Davis helps homeowners sue their HOAs and has been involved in helping pass laws to protect homeowners. He says often neighborhoods are still in the development period, and many residents who live there still don't even realize it.
The restrictive covenants in the HOA are primarily used to shift control away from the homeowners into an entity that the developer controls.
It makes sense that a lender or an investor is going to want to make sure that that vision that they bought into when they made that investment comes to fruition. The only way to ensure that is if the developer is in charge of that association.
Susan Wright heads up the Property Owners Association Task Force at the Texas Association of Builders.
During that period, why not be more transparent and say, this is not a homeowners association, it's a developers association? Because most of the homeowners tell us when they move in, they don't know that.
But that's not true. That's not a true statement. You're creating a homeowners association that is bringing value. You create it so that they do have a mechanism. They bought into the values that come.
But aren't they under the perception that they're going to have a vote and a voice?
No, I don't think so. Absolutely. And if they are, it's because they've never lived in one.
It makes me not want to pay my dues. You just let it sit in the back of your mind and fester, and you just get angrier and angrier, and it's made a lot of us very unhappy.
Oh yeah, now we do.
That was Brian Collister reporting. In some cases, homeowners might not know who controls their HOA because they don't know where to look. It can be easy to miss. Take a look at your HOA bylaws and covenants and look for the word declarant. That's the legal term for the developer or builder. If the declarant has the right to appoint members of the board, that means the developer essentially controls your HOA for as long as it wants. You may notice homeowners can be appointed to the board, but typically they either have no voting rights or the declarant has the majority of the votes on the board.
Give them, I think, the rights that they deserve, full rights that they deserve.
Homeowners with no control of their HOA. Now a state lawmaker is stepping in to help.
The developer is here to develop the community and then they leave and the control is turned over to the community. Unfortunately, that's not the situation here.
Homeowners have been reaching out to KXAN complaining they have no control over their own homeowners associations or how their dues are spent. And the developer or the builder has taken charge of the board, making important decisions those homeowners say are not always what they want. KXAN discovered the loophole in state law allowing developers to control an HOA for years, even decades. And we learned many of these homeowners don't even know what they're getting into when they buy their house. Just look at how that loophole works in favor of the builder in the two neighborhoods from our story. Lennar controls both HOAs and it's done so for years. That's because the way state law is currently written, there's no limit to the development period, essentially how long a developer or a builder can control an HOA, not the homeowners themselves. KXAN investigator Brian Collister took their concerns to State Representative Eddie Rodriguez. His South Austin district is experiencing a housing boom. Now he's looking at ways to change the law.
A lot of homeowners are frustrated. What can you do to help them?
Well, you know, I take when a constituent calls me, and I've had constituents call about this, not a horde of them, but a number of them have called. I take that very seriously. So I will look into it here internally in my office, see what we can do, understand what the current law is, see where there might be some ability to maybe close some of these loopholes if there are any, and to see what we can do to really weed out some of these bad actors.
Now, it's unlikely the legislature would limit the development period, but Rodriguez thinks it should be clearer to the home buyer. That's why we're making it easier with a step-by-step guide online showing how you can find out if your developer runs your HOA. Just search for this story in the investigative section of KXAN.com.
I think what I'm going to feel most privileged about is the trust that the voters have placed in me over so many years.
After decades in Washington, a congressman from Central Texas says it's time for him to leave. We'll look at why he's stepping aside and what that means for the people he represents on Capitol Hill. After 30 years representing Texas in the U.S. House, Congressman Lamar Smith announced he will retire at the end of his term. He was first elected in 1987. Congressman Smith has been critical in passing laws on patents and STEM education. He's a respected leader at both parties, but drew some controversy over some of its views, in particular his skepticism about climate change being caused by human activity. We asked him if the hyper-partisan environment in Washington drove him to retire. He says no.
As far as the atmosphere goes, it's what you make of it, and I'm certain that whoever is the next representative from the 21st District will take their judgment, will take their efforts, will take their energy to Washington, D.C. and put it into good practice.
Smith is currently the chairman of the powerful Science, Space, and Technology Committee, but he would have had to give up that role because of House term limits on chairing committees. Smith said that played a large role in his retirement. Smith's decision comes just days after another Texas Republican, Jeb Hensarling, announced he would be leaving Congress. For perspective, we turn to our panel. Jordan Berry is a political consultant and founder of Berry Communications. He's worked on several campaigns in Texas, and Jim Henson is the head of the Texas Politics Project at UT Austin, which does polling throughout the state. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks for having me.
What's going on? It seems like there's an exodus in Congress lately with so many people leaving, right?
Well, you know, there's always a certain turnover rate. I think, you know, Lamar Smith yesterday in interviews was being pretty quick to say, look, I'm not being driven out by the conflict or the mood or any of these big things. You know, I've been here a long time. I think that people are leaving for different reasons. I think the Texans probably are maybe a little bit different than some of the others. I don't know what Jordan thinks, but I think we talk a lot about the divisions and the chaos out there, but that becomes the hammer in which we hit every nail when somebody leaves. There's a lot of individual reasons that people have for this. I'm not sure that these two are part of a big trend, but we'll see who replaces them. Maybe that'll tell us more.
And some of the reasons we heard it is maybe because there is, kind of a limit on how long you can be a leader in a committee, right?
I think for both of them, it was simply their chairmanships were expiring, and they both thought it was time to pass the torch to the next generation.
Mm-hmm. It's not a surprise, though, right?
Well, I mean, it's not a surprise that people are leaving, but you never know. Maybe you had heard, maybe your phone was ringing. I think people had thought that Lamar Smith had been there a while, and he was getting ready to go. Hensarling was a little bit more of a surprise, I thought.
Yeah, I think with the Congressman Lamar Smith, he had a discussion with his wife. They're having their second grandbaby. He'd accomplished so much. I think he really just wanted to pass the torch to the next generation.
What about the Democrat side? I mean, does this kind of open up things with, Congressman Smith's district? I mean, being in San Antonio, does this kind of change any things for the partisan dynamic?
Well, unlike in a lot of places in the state, there was already a little bit of kind of a lot of Democratic action going on. A couple of three candidates, one candidate doing particularly well at fundraising in that district. I think you're less likely to see a lot of Democratic ferment in the Hensarling district. I think if you're on the Democratic side where there's not very much good news, any time that you can run in a race where there's not an incumbent in a Republican district, you're probably going to find a little bit more interest than you would otherwise. I don't see it leading to any fundamental shift or anything, though. But it's going to provide some opportunities for some people if they will kind of mobilize and get out there, as Jordan kind of alludes to. The Democrats have had a hard time with candidate recruitment, to say the least. Almost anything would help over the baseline of where they are now.
I think it's a safe Republican seat, and that the contest will be finished in the Republican primary.
Who's going to feel the most effect from this when a senior member of Congress is not going to be representing that district anymore?
Well, I think where we look at that is that these are members that had pretty good committee assignments in the majority party. And I think that's one of the things to look at, is that Texas loses in the short run, at least, a little bit of pull. But the term limits on the committee chairman that Jordan is talking about does help cycle people through a little more quickly. So it's not the kind of sting that it would have been, 20 years ago.
I'd almost like to see it in Texas to where we expire committee chairmanships. I think it's good and healthy for government just to reshuffle the deck and not allow too much power to be with one or two people.
Like on the state level, you mean?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that would be interesting. I don't know if some people would go for it, though. Is there...
Sounds like a speaker platform to me.
Right.
I'm just building a case.
Yes.
For the next speaker.
We'll see who listens to that, right? Is there a Trump effect? I mean, you kind of mentioned, a lot of people are quick to say that this is, what's happening in Washington right now, the turmoil. But really, I mean, when you come down to it, is that what people are going to think, and is that actually true?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think the press is going to be quick to think that and to look at that. I mean, look, there's undeniably something we might call a Trump effect at work in the political ether, in that a lot of the things that we found were predictable in politics, particularly at the national level, particularly coming out of the White House. A lot of those patterns are not holding. This is clearly a very different kind of president, to understate the case. And so I think that's out there. Whether it really applies in these cases, I'm not quite so sure. I don't think so, honestly.
Is this, it could be thought of as maybe pushing the incumbents out and getting some fresh blood in there, but that might have the same agenda as the president's administration?
Well, when you look at both Congressman Hensarling and Congressman Smith, neither of them had competitive primary opponents lined up for this cycle. So I don't think it has anything to do with their elections or anything to even do with President Trump. I think certain people just hit a stage in their career. Very few people ever do it, but they know when to go out on top.
Right.
Well, and remember, it's being a member of Congress, it's I mean, if you're interested in it and you have the calling, it's a great job. On the other hand, it's a job that's gotten a lot harder and not quite so glorious over the last, decade or so. If you look at congressional approval ratings, nationwide and in Texas, they're pretty terrible. I think that, Congress has had a harder time getting stuff done no matter what party is in charge. The job is just, it's not breaking rocks in the hot sun, but you work hard, and in recent years you've worked hard for kind of, minimal results. And I'm not surprised that even people that have been there relatively not as long, like Congressman Hensarling, kind of say, I've done my time, this has been satisfying, I've served, time to do something else.
Just think a year from now, we'll know it all, right?
with a new set of questions.
Yes, yes. Thank you both for being with us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
The power of the presidency could actually be limiting what our leaders can do for our country and their own legacies. That's the premise of a new book that takes a closer look at how the power and responsibility of the office keeps growing. Our Phil Prazen spoke with the author about the impact.
And joining us now is a professor at the University of Texas, Jeremy Suri. He's out with a new book, The Impossible Presidency, which tries to answer the question of, does the president have too much power right now, right?
Correct.
And so talk to me about how you got to that question.
Sure. So about 4 or 5 years ago, when I had finished my prior book, I began to think about why it was that our presidents have not been successful in a long time. Why have we not had a great president in a long time? And I came to the conclusion, beginning to do research in the presidential archives, looking at how presidents spend their time and use their power, that most presidents are actually trying very hard to achieve greatness in office, but they're trying to do too many things in too many places. And so the responsibilities and expectations have put them into a situation where they're spreading themselves too thin and often making some very bad choices.
And what do you think was the point where this office gained too much power?
Well, I try to show in my book that there really is a major transition between Franklin Roosevelt and John F. Kennedy. And I show this actually with their calendars, how they organize their time. Franklin Roosevelt is managing a country in depression and managing a world war. But he still has time to think. He can surround himself with different thinkers. He can really work through issues. He can make big choices. John F. Kennedy, just 20 years later, is pulled in so many directions. Think how many more countries have diplomats in Washington. Think how many more issues he has to deal with, that he barely has time to think things through in the way Roosevelt does. Kennedy's equally talented, but he underperforms because he doesn't have enough time to think through the issues.
So what did Truman and Eisenhower do at the presidents in between those two presidents that grew the office?
So what happened, actually, I argue, is that Franklin Roosevelt grew the office, and he was the last to barely manage it. Franklin Roosevelt brought the office into people's homes through the radio, and he made the President of the United States the President of the world. At the end of World War II, with the United Nations Charter, with the Atlantic Charter, the perception was and the expectation was that the United States would rebuild Western Europe, rebuild Japan. We took on responsibilities at home and abroad that were unthinkable for the founders. Roosevelt barely managed it, and those who came after him were taking on more than he was, and they were not able to manage it.
And people who might disagree with you would say, well, what about Reagan?
Yeah,
right? He had the vision at a high level and then kind of delegated, right?
Correct, correct. So I have a long chapter on Ronald Reagan, who I spent a lot of time researching and writing, and I have a lot of high regard for Ronald Reagan. He did some things really well. He transformed our relationship with the Soviet Union. But even Reagan, who recognized the problem of trying to do too much and tried to delegate, as you said, Phil, Reagan found himself pulled into too many issues. That's how Iran-Contra occurred. Reagan did not want to negotiate with terrorists, but he felt pressure to get Americans who had been taken hostage released. So what did he do? He negotiated with terrorists, and he broke the law.
And from my perspective, covering state government over the years, I think about how the state government is set up. And, we have an agriculture commissioner who is elected. That's part of the executive branch. We have a comptroller that's elected. All of these are still part of the executive branch, but they're not in one office, right? So how strange is the way our presidency is set up?
So this is one of the major insights, I think, in my book, which is that over time, our presidency has become more and more strange. As the executive branch has grown in its responsibilities, what we have not done at the federal level is just what you described that we've done at the state level. We have not created more offices that are elected by the people to serve the people. We've kept everything in the hands of one man. And it's not that presidents have wanted all that power. They've been stuck with it. And as a consequence, it's made it very hard for them to do anything well. They're pulled in too many directions. I argue they'd be better off if we did things at the federal level like we do at the state level, with multiple offices of executives elected.
And in the campaign season, this kind of leads for them promising the moon and the stars, right? Because they say, if you elect me, they kind of have to say that right now.
That's exactly right. They're pressed to actually address every single issue, small and big. So presidents are asked not just about what to do with North Korea or with the economy, they're asked about who should go to which bathrooms. And they're asked actually whether people should pray in one place at a football game, whether they should stand up or kneel. And so they get diverted into all these issues. You can have your own personal opinion about these issues. Those should not be the job of the executive of the United States.
Gosh. And so how does this impact Joe, Jane, Texan out there, people on a daily basis?
So I think on a daily basis, Americans are more and more frustrated, and I think that's part of what we saw in the 2016 election, because the perception is that this powerful office will serve them, and more promises are made. And when those promises are not fulfilled, voters, I think, quite appropriately say, this is not fair. I voted for you. I may have even given you money in your campaign, and you haven't done what you promised, and I'm angry. And I think many voters looked to blow up the office because they thought that presidents were not fulfilling their promises.
And you're going to be at the book festival today. Tell us a little bit about the event this afternoon.
So I'm going to be talking at the book festival along with my friend and colleague Matthew Dowd. We're going to be talking about how the presidency has changed over the last 100 to 200 years. Matthew Dowd has written a book about this, also worked closely with President George W. Bush. And he and I agree on some issues and disagree on others, and that's what we'll be talking about.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
Jeremy Suri will appear later today at the Texas Book Festival. His panel called Lead Me On, the New American Presidency starts at 1 o'clock this afternoon in the book tent at Congress and 10th Street. It is free and open to the public. Thank you again for joining us for State of Texas. Stay tuned for Meet the Press coming up at 9. I'm Josh Hinkle. Have a great day.